Please welcome to the stage Nicolette Bartlett, Chief Impact Officer at CDP, Emily McKenzie, Technical Director at TNFD, and Dan Neale, Social Lead at the Church Commissioners for England, for a conversation with Bloomberg's Alastair Marsh.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Bloomberg and welcome to this opening session. So we're talking about demystifying ESG disclosures. We're going to try not to make this a session complaining about CSDDD or any other acronym that you don't like. That's for the lunch break. This session is a group of experts gathered here covering a rich variety of topics or expertise from nature to human rights and climate. And so let's get into it. Let me ask you, so in this world of sort of sustainability, there's a lot of things to be disheartened by. So let's try to start on a high note if we can. And I'll ask each of you in turn, would you tell me what one recent or upcoming development as it relates to ESG disclosures that you're most encouraged by? Dan, let's start with you.
So actually, it's not so much the disclosure, but the legislation behind the disclosure. So the CSDDD, Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, big vote yesterday for the European MEPs. That, I think, it brings together the whole of the system that was behind it, which is, if you look at SFDR, CSRD, CSDDD, but basically, it's the thing that was missing, which is the legislation that says you have a directive, here's the directive, you need to do the due diligence, and then you report against it under the CSRD. So for me, it's the legislation that actually puts the onus on companies and says you have to do these due diligence activities.
Right, so moving from talking to doing.
Yeah.
Great. Emily, how would you answer that?
Yes, I would probably talk about the very, very fresh news that was announced on Tuesday by the International Sustainability Standards Board, which agreed to move forward with two projects, one on nature, the other on human capital. But for nature, that means now we've put in place a process for moving it into the global sustainability reporting baseline. So that's the breaking news that's very exciting in the nature space.
Fantastic. And Nicolette, how about you?
Yeah, I'd echo both of those. And I think what I would draw on is the fact that this is built on a strong foundation of companies doing this globally, both for nature. But so obviously I'm speaking from the environmental perspective, not including the social, which I think is vital. But I would also just remind us of that, you know, we have, through CDP's system, we can see that companies all over the world, our second biggest disclosing country is China. Our third is Japan. The ASEAN companies that are disclosing right now are disclosing and will be disclosing this year in the CDP system, fully aligned with ISSB S2. So I kind of always want to draw down on that in the real economy, the foundation of this is really, really strong, and the legislation that is coming on top of it anchors that and ensures that everyone is coming into the process, but it's not coming out of nowhere. And that's always what kind of keeps me going when I see another acronym coming out the door.
Fantastic. Okay, well, so you say it's not coming out of nowhere. That's exactly right. You know, this sort of voluntary architecture that we're talking about, a lot of it's been developing or being developed for many years. But there are many indicators that suggest, perhaps unevenly, perhaps not at the same speed everywhere, but that we're kind of broadly moving from a voluntary world to a mandatory world. Can we talk a little bit about how far down that road we are really? And I mean, perhaps you could speak about the specialist areas that you have, but there's a lot of crossover between them. So who would like to kind of kick us off with that one? How far down the road are we?
I'm happy to start. I would say for nature, it really depends on the jurisdiction. So at TNFD, we're not a standard, we're not a regulator, we're a voluntary market-led initiative trying to create a credible, consistent way of managing nature-related risks and opportunities and disclosing on them. But we, unlike TCFD, had to work with the regulator right from the get-go with the European regulators because European sustainability reporting standards have folded in TNFD's LEAP approach. All of our disclosures and metrics sit within that. So that's where, in that jurisdiction, it's already mandatory. There are others where it's not, and each jurisdiction will vary. So I think we're looking at a kind of a patchwork that will emerge. But I think for many jurisdictions, 130 plus jurisdictions, the decision on Tuesday by the ISSB obviously will be influential to see, because putting in place the global standards as a sort of foundation then for considering whether something would be mandatory.
I think for social, we're still the poor cousin. We are further down the road than we were on Monday, so that's good. But there's still a long way to go. Some people may be aware there's an idea of the TIFD or the TSFD, the inequality or social inequality related financial disclosure task force that's in the sort of process of working up, but it's still a way back. And part of the need for that is because, in part, ISSB has not done a social one alongside climate. And there's that gap then in terms of those international sustainability standard boards around the social topic, and particularly human rights. So we're further, but we're still quite a long way to go on the social, I think.
Okay.
We certainly are moving from voluntary, but I wouldn't frame it as from one to the other. We're moving into a world where mandatory is coming in, thank goodness. This is what we've all been wanting, right? And the thing about regulation is it starts to make it real across the whole economy. It starts to put it into practice, but you still need the data on the data to work out what works, what is decision useful, because we're only at the start of the journey. And there are huge, there's a long game to go to get it into a place where you have decision useful data and that you also make a distinction for why that data is needed. So in many cases, much of the ISSB regulation coming in is focused for climate on the financial markets, financial stability. That's access to capital. That's only one of the data use cases. The others we would see is a bigger class, even from a driver perspective for, in our experience of corporate disclosure, is business risks, business opportunities, business competitiveness, we call it. And one of the biggest drivers there is buyers, supply chains, which is not just being driven by regulatory, it's being driven by the very fact that actually it's reducing their risks and opportunities by having this disclosure coming through to them. And their needs are slightly distinct from what the finance sector needs. And then you've got, obviously, what the data that companies need to collect for compliance. And all three of those are not the same thing, always. There's a huge overlap, but they're not always the same thing. So the journey is starting. And I think we're going to now be focused on bringing it into a space where it's interoperable, where it's comparable, but also where you have the data being structured and developed into decision useful data for those different audiences and different purposes.
Can I just build on that? Because I'm fresh from a really fantastic trip to Asia last week, where I was in both Singapore and Hong Kong, and there were many there from the region. And there, for nature, they do not yet have it as mandatory, but huge interest and uptake, really framed around the way Nikki just placed it, around this being essential to their strategy, their business model, or their risk and return for their investment decisions. So it's a very exciting region in Asia. 42% of the now 370 organizations that are early adopters of the TNFD framework are in Asia. And it's really driven by that mindset rather than compliance, which means it's a very interesting, very dynamic region. We have a number of adopters who've already disclosed TNFD reports, which they can do because they've already been reporting on CDP GRI for a long time. So the foundations are there, they're getting useful insights. It's very interesting.
I deliberately started this session talking on a high because I thought we might at some point go into the valleys. And if I put my sort of cynical hat on, one might say that, you know, if you look at the CSDD or you look at the SEC climate disclosure rule, there's sort of been, you know, some of that's been watered down or pushed back. The SEC is facing kind of legal challenge. And there's a lot of people complaining about the cost of compliance. This is hard to do. This is difficult, and so on. And then you have, especially in the US, but it does manifest on this side of the pond, the kind of anti-ESG backlash phenomenon, whatever you want to call that. And it's interesting to think about how inevitable this shift from sort of voluntary to mandatory is, and if we're running out of steam on it. And then if you think most recently, like, you know, one of the most obvious or clear pillars of the kind of voluntary architecture, you know, the SBTI, what's been happening there, there's questions about its credibility. I mean, rightly or wrongly, that's going to be ironed out. But I guess my question is, like, you know, how is this going to be how's this going to play out? Are we sure that this is kind of, are we, all the things that we've described about the train's moving in that direction, is it really moving in that direction? I mean, Nicolette, you have some involvement with the SBTi. Maybe you could talk about that, but maybe you could also zoom out and talk about, is the pushback having any impact on this sort of mandatory train?
Well, I'll take a step back from that, and just the pushback generally across all of society in every jurisdiction on one element of this is happening. But I think we should be careful of calling it voluntary always. I think what we're seeing now, because it in reality hasn't always been voluntary. If investors want it, at least in our experience, if the investors want the data, if a buyer wants the data, the company leans in to disclose it. So it's not necessarily voluntary to some degree, right? And why I mention that is because I think that's part of this trend. There is the investment in the kind of new green economy is happening. That's not going away. Mm-hmm. It's delivering returns. Reducing risks is something companies literally have to do. That's their job, right? As part of their duties. And so that driver is not going to go away because it's real. It's not fluffy. It's not some voluntary thing, right? That's real. And so I think what we're seeing now is a maturing of the market and things, the ISSB forming and taking the alphabet soup in, as they love to say. That's one of those signals, right? Where things are standardizing and becoming formal inside of governance processes, all of that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. The regulation builds on those, right? Regulation doesn't sit over here and do it all magically in the corner, even though it feels like it sometimes. It's built on norms and practices and standards bodies that actually pervade the entire financial sector and across the real economy. So I think for me, there will be pushback against regulation. There always is. And this data is actually changing, and the kind of practices around the data, the standards around the data, the standards around transition plans, targets, whatever it may be, the way risk frameworks are developing, those are being standardized and are being used in very real capital alignment and access to capital decisions. So that's not going away. And so I think where we may see a focus is focusing in on what is decision useful, but it doesn't, for me, if there's a pushback, which there's always a pushback against the regulation, that doesn't mean the trend on this dies overnight.
Okay. Do you guys agree?
Yeah, the need for, say, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, voluntary measures weren't working. Companies weren't volunteering to respect human rights. So the UN Guiding Principles, Business Human Rights came out in 2011. The UK was the first country to come up with a national action plan on business human rights. And wildly across the world, companies don't meet those fundamental expectations and they don't demonstrate that they're meeting them. So the legislation is a response to that. And a lot of companies fought very hard against that legislation, and to your point, to try and water it down and push it back. But the legislative flaw, and I think this is another point to remember with this, that the legislation is the very bare minimum, so that the companies who are active in the space can have a level playing field to work from. Because at the moment, it's a bit of a Wild West in some respects, and you can't actually do the comparison between those who don't and those who are, because they're almost at a first mover disadvantage on that. So I think it is good progress on that side. As to the pushback, that's naturally, I think, what companies are going to do. I not necessarily want to get into the ESG pushback and how that works with the culture wars in the States, because I think that's a slightly different issue to actually driving sustainability and positive outcomes.
Okay, but so what we're talking about broadly here is that sort of progress on sustainability is both forced down from the top. Maybe you don't like the word force, but forced from the top. But also there's demand from the bottom, that it's business useful, and there's yeah.
I would definitely say that we have evidence of that with TNFD, because what TNFD has created is, well, there's a D in our acronym, so people associate us with disclosure. Yeah. And yes, we're a set of disclosure recommendations. We always try to emphasize we're a risk and opportunity management framework. We give insights for strategy, for capital allocation decisions, like Nikki's emphasizing. And so we have produced, yes, a set of disclosure recommendations, but also a bundle of guidance. And one of those is a kind of due diligence process for how you assess and identify your material nature-related issues. So we can track adoption of TNFD. Only 6% were in the US of our early adopter group. but we can also track downloads of our guidance and the amount of feedback we're getting from particular regions. And both of those are very high in the US. It's just to take that as a specific region in the broader term. So I would say in terms of demand, the bottom-up demand for getting the insights that are about what are my most material issues, how are they affecting my risk, my return, my profits, everybody has huge and growing demand for that.
Excellent. Okay. Now on this, what's exciting about this panel is sort of the variety of expertise that we have. Now there's people in the room, CSO, sustainability professionals in businesses, and sustainable investors. Let's talk a little bit about how we can thread these themes together. I mean, we don't have to make it awkward or forced, but of course, if you are a CSO or you are a responsible investor, you have to think about human rights, you have to think about nature, you have to think about climate, Paris alignment, and all the rest of it. So let's talk a little bit about how these things kind of come together, how you can take an integrated approach. Who would like to open up with that one?
I'm happy to give a couple of examples. The first is that we have built from TCFD but on purpose, one, to start from what many, many people understand already once they start to think about nature, but also to encourage and enable an integrated approach, because as soon as people start thinking about it, you realize nature and climate are highly connected, both from the risk side, climate change being one of the drivers of nature loss, but also from the opportunity side, nature being a third of what we need for climate mitigation coming from nature as an asset, providing carbon sequestration and storage. So I see that really starting to manifest concretely, yes, in integrated disclosures. Some organizations are already doing integrated TNFD, TCFD disclosures, and ISSB will speed that process up, I'm sure. But also in our context of transition planning. So we're starting now to look at, we're developing guidance around transition planning and doing that in collaboration with GFANs, who are focusing on nature for net zero transition plans, while we take on nature for nature positive or nature goal transition plans. So that's on the climate side, where I see it really becoming real. And on the human rights side, one part of our guidance package is around engagement with Indigenous peoples, local communities, and affected stakeholders. And one of the things about nature is it manifests in real places on the ground. It is location specific, as we say. So if you're having significant impacts, negative or positive, or depending on water or some other environmental resource, it's in a particular place. And others in that community will be both stewards of nature and affected by what a business is doing. And that's why we drew on the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, on the OECD multinational guidance, to develop really detailed guidance on this and the linkage with due diligence and human rights. So for me, as soon as you start seeing thinking about these issues, the connections become real, they become practical, and that's manifested in what we've written.
And I think, so the climate problem, the nature problem, they're all people problems. If people are left behind during the net zero transition, they will stop the transition, they will act against that. And it's the same, the people who are going to be a big part of that nature solution are those Indigenous peoples, those human rights defenders on there. We look at the world through 3 systemic interlinked risks of climate change, nature loss, and social inequality. And at the heart of that is that sort of respect for people that underpins the just transition bit for that. So I think in terms of the integration, I can bang the drum for social because I said it's far behind. Actually placing the understanding what the risks and impacts to people are based on your actions or inactions, I think is a critical part for that integration into how you approach climate and nature, because they're not just technical solutions. And if the people aren't part of that, your plan is not going to work.
Right, exactly.
And I think this is why the CSRD and CSDDD are bad. So it was really interesting this morning from that roundtable, just hearing the voices, and I've heard this over and over in the last year, and in every jurisdiction, so not just European companies, who are using, either they are recognizing the extent to which they now need to report into this framework. But then what they've got to is a place where they are going to, if they're already on that journey anyway, they've been doing this, they are using that as their way of integrating it within their organization and then drawing all other regulation from it. And I think that's really what, so they were actually, I mean, the word painful was used a few times, but they weren't saying they're not like getting warm and fluffy about it, but they are certainly noticing that it helps them to bring the things together. And I think that's a really, as it kept being said over and over again, it's a framework where we can bring all this together finally. And I think that's amazing.
I think there's huge demand for that, huge demand, because nobody wants things sliced and diced in a million different ways that don't speak to each other. Yeah. So I think that's the direction of travel.
Okay, with just a few minutes left, let me ask you a final question. I could have made this my first question, but it's a good way to end. And the question is, why does this matter? By which I mean, we're talking about disclosure frameworks and so on, but what we need to get the world on a Paris alignment trajectory, or to restore nature, or to respect human rights, is not to fill out more forms, it's to actually take action. So how does, can we talk just a little bit about how the frameworks we've discussed actually help serve that ultimate ambition?
So one slice of it is on that accountability. So outside of the business, how investors and how broader society holds companies accountable for that. Companies are social constructs. They have a role in society, and that should hopefully be a positive role. The data that comes out enables stakeholders to hold those companies to account. And so for, as a universal investor, for instance, we're not just interested in a company making alpha when it destroys the beta in the market. And so if a company does really, really well, but trashes the rest of the economy or supports genocide or something like that, that's not really useful for us. So I think for our side, it is just one slice is that accountability, the data to actually enable informed decision making.
Yeah. I mean, I'll give 3 very dull stats, but just because that's my job. But I think we consistently see this. First of all, we can't make the decisions we need to make that are quite urgent without data. That's just a fact. It's a foundation. Disclosure drives some of that data, right? So that's an obvious point, I say that. But so we found 3 things. One is of the supply chain members in our system, so we've got 340 global multinationals that have like 6 trillion in procurement power, huge driver for change. They have driven in the last few years over 600 million tons of emissions cuts with their incentives, their rules around procurement, etc. And it's been driven based on the data they've received, which was driven by disclosure. And they've saved suppliers 33 billion, right? Which is a number that those suppliers really care about. When we look at the companies, so they've been supply chain members for quite some time. They've been seeing the data. 1 in 10 of them now all have a climate-related rule in their procurement, like a hard rule, not just a sort of incentive, but an actual hard rule. And so we tracked 223 companies that have disclosed consistently on water between 2015 and 2023, okay? And they've significantly reduced their water withdrawals, because that's one of the things we track consistently over time. And that's from doing it and using it as a risk framework for themselves, because actually, interestingly, we had to really build the case with investors at first about water being an access to capital issue or procurement issue. But the companies themselves started to see it as a risk management issue. So that's just those 3 very dull stats, and they seem small. We've got thousands of them where this practice and then the data itself drives a change in decisions.
Fantastic, thank you.
It's hard to follow Nikki, because Nikki's the expert with all the data of how this really drives change, but it's certainly part of our theory of change. So our theory of change is to contribute to halting and reversing biodiversity loss, which has been agreed by nearly 200 governments now around the world, by shifting financial flows away from the activities that are harming nature towards those that make it thrive, and using disclosure as a vehicle to do that. But ultimately underneath it, as I emphasise, this is really about risk and opportunity management. So what's really interesting to me is the conversation is now also really about opportunities. And the great thing about nature is you can see an upside very quickly. In fact, if you just leave nature alone, it recovers. You don't even need to actively do anything. Protected areas are great. So there's a real emphasis now, I think, on the opportunity side.
Fantastic. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. Thank you for listening, and thank you, panelists, very much.
That was quick.
That was quick. Thank you.